In the same way, it's a module. That is to say, McDonald's is a standardizing module. The same is true, of course, for the Soviet collective farm. Soviet collective farms were laid out as modules with the machine sheds in one place, with the management offices in another place, with the accounting offices in another place. And to the extent that they were, let's say, all grain farmers or producing fodder crops or raising pigs, these were also standardized as well in terms of the units that were built. And it allowed someone in a centralized economy not to just control what they planted and when they planted it, but to make sure when they visited any collective farm that it was being run according to this standardized module. I've written about this standardization as it affected the history of forests. That is, forests are, if you like, primary growth forests or deciduous forests that haven't been heavily logged and managed are, if you like, vernacular forests. And therefore they're idiosyncratic from place to place and so on. And therefore they are very difficult to manage. They're very difficult to predict the revenue that you will get from such forests. So the princes of Saxony and Prussia at the end of the 18th century decided that they would like to rationalize their finances. This was called at the time cameral science. And the effort then was to make sure that the great forests that these princes owned would yield a reliable, steady, and predictable revenue. And since the price of the wood that was gathered from these places was varied from place to place, from year to year, it was not easy to standardize. And so the effort was made to actually take a census of the forest. What they did was to choose what they thought was a representative sample of the forest. And on that basis, what they did was to train 20 assistants, and they were trained to recognize 5 different size classes of trees. So they went through the forest every day in this sort of sample of the forest, and they would come to a tree, each tree, and they had a tray around their neck with 5 bins, each with color-coded nails in them, and they would take out a nail coinciding with the size class of that tree, pound it in the tree, and move on. At the end of a month or so, they had, if you like, a complete census of every tree in the forest in this huge area. Then, under certain assumptions about how fast trees grow, they were able to produce the tables that are the tables today of scientific forestry. And what they did first was to cut down the first growth, because they knew now, using geometry, exactly how much firewood they could get, how much lumber they could get out of these trees. They then, after they took their first cutting, they made the next step, which is the crucial one. They realized that there were 2 trees that were the fastest growing, most successful producers of logs, and those were the Norway spruce and the Scotch pine, depending on the soil class. And so in place, after clear cutting, they then planted either Scotch pine or Norway spruce, depending on the soil. For 80 years, this system worked brilliantly. It became the standard of scientific forestry in Germany, in France, in the United States, in India, because the first rotation of trees, which took 80 years then, was incredibly successful. And it's in that period that it became the world standard for scientific revenue-producing forestry. However, as near as we can tell, what happened was that that first rotation was using the accumulated soil capital of the previous old-growth forest. And that's why it grew so fast. So within another 20 years after the first rotation, that is to say after 100 years, the forest started to grow in a much slower way. Trees started to die. And the Germans invented the term Waldsterben, or forest death, and restoration forestry. And it turned out, of course, that they had created a standardized forest, a monocrop forest, all the same species, all the same age, all planted at the same time. And it was also a poverty-stricken ecological forest in the terms of the diversity of insects, of mammals, of birds, and so on. It was, in a sense, a kind of green desert, and it had ecological consequences that they hadn't bargained on. The standardization project that was a project of creating a nation, and I think some of these standardizing projects, French citizenship would be another such project, is an emancipatory project. It gave every Frenchman a right to the same legal entitlements under French law, no matter where they were. It eliminated feudalism. So a great deal of what the nation-state's project of standardization was emancipatory as well. This work was first a national project. It has now become, I think it's fair to say, an international project. Until 1989, it was a bipolar project. That is to say, there was a socialist bloc with its modules of standardization. You could go to Angola, to Mozambique, to Vietnam, to Cuba, to Bulgaria, to China, and you could find recognizably the same planning ministries, the same statistical techniques, the same engineering curriculum, the same organization of ministries, the same socialist techniques of mobilization and organization and so on. It was a module that traveled throughout the Third World. Of course, it had cultural variations, but it was nonetheless a kind of modernization module. Now, of course, since 1989, it's a unipolar project, the so-called Washington Consensus, or at least until last week. I thought of staying here as an economic refugee, actually, when I came on the plane today, if Trent would have me. That is, this Washington Consensus, its goal is to create a neoliberal institutional order that is homogeneous over the whole world. It's what I would call an imminent project in the sense that it will never be completely successful. But it is a project of standardization. It is a project of de-vernacularization. That is, to the destruction of vernaculars and to replace them with a kind of neoliberal institutional order over the whole world. And the institutional lords of this project are the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, the UN for that matter, and the European Union, and of course the neoliberal lords in Washington. The euphemism for this process, it's a euphemism used in the EU, it's a euphemism used in the IMF. I love it because it's the most beautiful propaganda slogan I could possibly imagine. It's called harmonization. And when you think of it, this is just, I don't know what ad agency or what brilliant bureaucrat came up with this, but the idea of everyone singing in harmony in this beautiful symphony of neoliberal order. I can't imagine a better euphemism for this process than harmonization. If we wanted to point to the largest project of standardization now being undertaken in the world, it is the effort to create individual freehold property all over the world.